Terry. Thank you. Yeah, and all the music sounded fine. I'm glad all of you are here. We've got a number of people out still celebrating this Memorial Day week vacation stuff. But I'm glad that all of you are here. And we're going to, of course, we're filming this, so others will hear it besides just us here tonight. I want you to feel free to put your hand up if you've got a question, a comment, an addendum to anything I'm saying. The last time I spoke on the life of Christ on a Wednesday night, a couple of Wednesdays ago, I believe, we had this business in John chapter 6 where Jesus talks to all the people. They have showed up the next day after eating the loaves and fishes, and they say, "We want some more of that." And he says, "Well, really, I've got some bread to give you that you don't know anything about, and I'd like to give that to you." And he begins this discourse of, "I am the bread came down from heaven. You must eat of my flesh and drink of my blood if you're going to have life in you." No matter how you explain that, they couldn't get the metaphor or figure it out. That's just the strangest sounding thing. And we have this, John 6, verse 66. "Upon this, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him." Now, many New Testament scholars mark that statement as being the collapse of the Galilean ministry. This was in Galilee and where he had most of his biggest crowds. Now, that's not all over with. He'll have some more crowds in Galilee. But he's reached the pinnacle, and now even some of his followers are looking at one another and wondering, who is this guy to say things like that? Before we're through tonight, we'll see that even some of his closest disciples will begin to wonder about him, because before we're through tonight, Jesus will finally let the cat out of the bag to them, saying, for the first time, "I haven't come to live or to rule, I've come to die." We'll be going down to Jerusalem soon, and I will be handed over to the chief priests, the scribes, and Pharisees, and they will torture and crucify me. But I'll rise again on the third day. He has never said this to them. And they get upset. Peter grabs him by the arm and says, "These things will never be." And there Jesus famously calls him Satan. "Get thee behind me, Satan." But let's work up to this. Jesus turns to the 12 while all these other thousands are walking away, and he said, "What about you 12 guys? Would you also go away?" And Peter, excuse me, Peter answers him, "Lord, if we left you, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." So now, Jesus moves over towards probably Capernaum. Let's go to Mark chapter 7, verse 1. Now, this little story is told also in Matthew 15 and John chapter 7. It will be an argument over the washing of hands. Mark 7, verse 1. "And there gathered together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which had come from Jerusalem, and had seen that some of Jesus' disciples ate their bread with defiled," or that is, unwashed hands. Not really defiled. They're just not washed. But if they don't wash them ceremoniously in a pan before eating, the Pharisees would call that defiled hands. "For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands diligently, eat not, beholding the tradition not of Moses, but of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, and except they wash themselves, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold, washings of cups and pots and brazen vessels." And the Pharisees, see, Mark puts all that in. The Pharisees ask him, I'm in verse 5, "Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with defiled hands?" And Jesus goes into this thing, and I know I closed giving this last time I spoke, that it's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him. It's the words that come out of his mouth from his heart. That's what defiled the man. And you'll want to read that. He goes on for some time about all the terrible things that people say with their mouths, while you people are worried about has a person scrubbed his fingernails properly or something. Now, if you go over to John 7, verse 1, John goes into this same story, but John says something they don't say. John chapter 7, verse 1. And after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now, John has already shown us twice that Jews are threatening to kill Jesus. And that's going to build more and more as we enter this last year of his ministry. Let's jump over to his visit to the Syro-Phoenician region. Mark chapter 7, let's look at verse 24, Brother Jeremy. And from thence he arose and went away into the borders of Tyre and Sidon. Now, a lot of people say that Jesus never left the country of Palestine. He was always in Galilee or Gilead or Samaria or Judea. That's the land borders of ancient Israel. But we do know he left Israel when he was a child. He went and lived as an infant in Egypt for a couple of years until King Herod died. And in this passage, it's kind of without doubt that he goes, says, into the borders of Tyre and Sidon. That's up at Lebanon. The Matthew version says he withdrew into the parts of Tyre and Sidon. So he enters into a house in Mark and doesn't want anybody to know it. He's not come there to be seen. He's come there to try and get away from people. He could not be hid. Next verse. That straightway a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, having heard of him, came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by nation. Now let's just stop right there. She's got a triple ancestry. Some part of her ancestors were Greeks. Some of them were Syrians. And some of them were Phoenicians. Now, those are the Phoenicians that founded the ancient cities of Tyre and Sidon. So she's all mixed up. The strange thing is that in the Matthew version, Matthew 15:22, it says, and behold, a Canaanitish woman came from the borders and cried, asking Jesus to have mercy on because of her little daughter. So now we have 4 descriptions for her race. And what's interesting about this is we've got the Greeks in this woman, represented in this woman, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, which, by the way, the Philistines were also of Phoenician descent, and the Canaanites. She's a Canaanitish woman. Here's Jesus has gone into this non-Jewish city, whether it's Tyre or Sidon. He's up on that Lebanon seacoast. And we have this one incident while he's there of dealing with this woman. But she represents the major Gentile races that Israel had to deal with in the Old Testament. Is that interesting to you? And she's worried about her daughter. Still in the Mark version. She said she besought him that he would cast forth the devil out of her daughter. And he says to her, well, let me jump over, Brother Jeremy, to the Matthew version. Matthew has something right here that Luke doesn't have. Matthew 15:22. And behold, a Canaanitish woman came out from those borders and cried, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. Now, Mark simply says the little girl simply had an unclean spirit. Matthew says she's grievously vexed by it. But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. But he answered and said, maybe to them, maybe to her, maybe to all, he said, I was not sent, but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, why do you think he says that? Here he's in this most pagan of Gentile cities on the Palestinian coast. He went there. They didn't pull him there. And he says, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Yeah. Yeah. You mean the centurion's servant. Servant. Yeah. So I think Jesus does want to go to everywhere, but he's teaching his disciples a lesson. His disciples have just come to him and said, Send her away. Let's get out of here. And Jesus looks at them and says, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came over and worshiped him and says, Lord, help me. And he answers and says, It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it unto the dogs. The Mark version of that, verse 27, Jesus said to her, Let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. Now, he's implying that she's a dog. Is she going to pick up on the implication? His disciples want her treated like a dog. She's this mongrelized Gentile, Canaanite, Phoenician, Philistine, Greek woman, Syrian. She ain't nothing but a hound dog. Elvis was right about her. You don't want to mess with her, Lord Jesus. We just went through this thing about being unclean. The Pharisees attacked us for being unclean because we touched unclean people, and now you're going to deal with this nasty woman? Well, let's stay in the Mark version. Next verse. Verse 28, Brother Jeremy. And she answered and said unto him, Well, yea, Lord, yet the dogs, even the dogs under the table, eat of the children's crumbs. And in the Matthew version, you don't have to turn there, she says, Yea, Lord, for even the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Now in this, I love it. She's saying, I know what you Jewish people believe about non-Jews. You've got ugly words you call us. You call us Gentiles. It's actually from the Hebrew word goyim, which means, guess what? Dogs. The word Gentile means dog. And it's their word for everybody that's not one of them in this time. So she's well aware of that. She says, okay, I'll be a dog. If that's what's necessary, I'll go ahead and be a dog. Curse me. But let me have some crumbs of healing from your table. And he said unto her, For this saying, go thy way, lady. The devil is gone out of thy daughter. Now in the Matthew version, Jesus answers and says, verse 28 in Matthew, O woman, great is thy faith. Be it done unto thee even as thou wilt. Now, here's a Gentile woman, and he is appreciating her for having great faith. Just as when the centurion had come to Jesus to get his servant healed, Jesus had looked at that centurion and said to his disciples, See this man's great faith? I've never seen faith so great as that he has in all of Israel. So here is Jesus goes up there just to meet this woman. It's like it's divinely orchestrated to give his disciples another lesson on what the Lord really wants to do. Now this business of I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, this speaks to their attitude that they can't let go of. Do you know that after Jesus is risen from the dead and walks 40 days with his disciples and is about to ascend into heaven, he says, do you have one more question? They say, yes. Will you at this time restore the kingdom unto Israel? And he says, man, you guys have missed it all along. You're still on that, aren't you? Israelite supremacy in God's eyes over all the other nations. No, you're going to get filled with the Spirit of God, be endued with power. The world's not coming to Israel. You're going to go to the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Took them a while to make this quantum shift. Am I making sense? But I love that little story. Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Oh, and of course the lady returns to her house and her daughter's just fine. And so, verse 31, and Jesus again goes out from the borders of Tyre and comes through Sidon into the Sea of Galilee. So here's the Mediterranean coast, Tyre and Sidon. Jesus leaves there and goes overland until he hits the Sea of Galilee, this inland lake that separates, well, on one side you're in Galilee, and the other side you're in Gilead, because the Sea of Galilee is actually only a big wide blob in the flow of the Jordan River. The Jordan flows into it north end and flows out of it on the south end. So he gets up there and goes across and comes out on the borders of the Decapolis. Now, that's Greek, Decapolis, Decapolis. Deca means 10, polis means cities. 10 cities that had been built by the Greeks following the death of Alexander the Great. And they're clustered nearby in this part of what used to be Gilead. And Jesus goes there. And they bring unto him, I love this one, Destin and I were kind of talking about some of these miracles a little before church. They bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseech him to lay his hands on him. And Jesus doesn't do it until he takes the deaf guy, away from them. Now this is curious because we're going to see the same thing happen again. He'll take the sick person away from the crowd. And he took him away aside from the multitude privately, put his fingers into the man's ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Please don't be spitting on your hand and then wiping it off on my tongue, please. But Jesus does it. And looking up into heaven, he sighed and saith unto him, Ephphatha. And that is, it's an Aramaic word, by the way. I don't know why all Aramaic words in the New Testament aren't printed out and then interpreted, but 4 or 5 of them, we get the actual Aramaic word. He says, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the bond of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. And Jesus charged them that they should tell no man. But of course, as always, the more he charges them, so much the more a great deal they published it. And Matthew joins in the story here, but we'll just, pretty much the same as the Mark version, we'll stick with it. And so now we're going to have another interesting miracle within nature. Not a miracle of healing of someone, but a miracle against the laws of nature. And it's another feeding of thousands with just a handful of little fishes. They are beyond measure astounded, saying he's done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. In those days, when there was again a great multitude and they had nothing to eat, he called unto him his disciples and said, I have compassion on this multitude because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Now, the last time this happened, the feeding of the 5,000, they were just with him all that day. But these people have been with him 3 days, listening to him teach. And he says, I'm afraid if we send them away home, some of them will faint on their way home. And his disciples asked him, well, where are we going to be able to fill these men with bread here in this desert place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they answer, 7. Now in the Matthew version, they say 7 and a few small fishes. Matthew adds it's loaves and fishes again. But anyway, the Mark version, when Jesus commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and giving thanks, he brake them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the multitude. And they had a few small fishes. There Mark comes up with the fishes also. And having blessed them, he commanded to set these also before them. And they did eat and were filled, and they took up of broken pieces that remained over 7 baskets. And they were about 4,000. Now the Matthew version says they that did eat were 4,000 men beside their women and children. So it could be 8,000 to 12,000 there. Now this is going to come up in a conversation soon between Jesus and his disciples in a boat where they're a little worried about food, and he recalls the 2 miraculous multiplications of food. So let's continue with Mark. Jump over to Mark chapter 8, verse 10. I hope this is interesting to all of you. And straightway he entered into the boat with his disciples, came unto the parts of Dalmanutha. Now, nobody remembers where Dalmanutha is, but Matthew said it was a place called Magadan, which many scholars believe, if you look at Matthew 15:39, the place they go to is a place called Magadan, and many believe that's the same as Magdala, where a famous woman named Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdalena, came from. But anyway, and the Pharisees came forth, began to question with him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, and tempting him. And he sighs deeply in his spirit and says, why does this generation seek a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall no sign be given unto this generation. Oh, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense either, does it? Because they have seen him do sign after sign. He just fed 8,000 to 12,000 people with a handful of hamburger buns, and they're all full. What kind of a sign do you guys want? You just saw me give clear speech to a tongue-tied boy by spitting on his tongue. What kind of sign do you want? Well, in the Matthew version, he goes a little further. Go to Matthew 15, verse 2. Matthew 15, 2. Well, I'm sorry, Jeremy, 16, 2. I've got good glasses, I just don't look well through them sometimes. And Jesus answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you Pharisees, you say, well, it'll be fair weather because the sky is red. Next verse. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today because the sky is red and lowering. Oh, you hypocrites. You stand around prognosticating the weather. You think you can discern the face of the sky and all of this, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. Next verse. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Now, signs have been given you, and you pay no attention to them. You want to pick and choose your signs. Well, all right. You will be given one. There'll be no sign given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. What in the world does that mean? The only sign you'll get will be the sign of the prophet Jonah. What do you think, Rachel? Nancy? Dave? Anybody? Julie? What was the big sign? See, Jonah goes to Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria, and he comes into Nineveh preaching. In 40 days, the Lord God of Israel is going to destroy your entire city. And the king of Nineveh repents and says, I'll pray then to your God. And he commands the entire city of Nineveh to fast and pray for 40 days. They won't even let the dogs and cats eat anything for 40 days. And God sees this and turns his hand from Nineveh, and they are spared. Now here's the question. This madman, Jonah, comes in from the seacoast to Nineveh saying, God's going to destroy you in 40 days. You better stop eating for 40 days. And they listened to him. Would you listen to somebody who came and told you to do that? Well, I mean, you're right, Brother Terry. He didn't say that we have. But that's how they respond. The point is they believe him. And why do they believe him? Because of the sign. He had been dead for 3 days and nights for all intents and purposes in the belly of a whale. I'm sorry? Yeah, and was resurrected and spewed out. They see this. That whale beached and this guy came crawling out of it. Well, look, whales and other marine animals swallow fish with all their bones, all their scales. They swallow them by their hundreds, by the hundreds, and they've got such strong stomach acids for digestion. They just dissolve all those bones up. Now, Jonah was preserved from that, but you can bet it took all the hair off his body and turned his skin pale. He comes out of there looking like a zombie. You know, he's weird looking. I was interrupting you, Brother Terry. Go ahead.
No, you're along the same line. He came out different in his human look than it was a normal human person, just like Jesus came out of the grave.
And they didn't know him at first. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So where were we? And he left them and departed. So this is when oh, hold on. I'm on the wrong page again. So I like this. I'm going to skip on down to Mark chapter 8, verse 22. And they come to Bethsaida, and they bring unto him a blind man, and beseech him to touch the blind man. And he took hold of the blind man by the hand, and brought him out of the village. Second time we read this in Mark. Jesus takes the guy that they want to see a miracle worked for the guy. Jesus says, let me take this guy aside, just me and him. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked him, seest thou aught? And the man looked up and said, I see men, for I behold them as trees walking. In other words, I see people, but I can't tell the difference between people and trees, except the people must be the ones that are moving forward and the trees are the ones standing still. But men and trees look the same to me, except for their movement. Then again he laid his hands upon the man's eyes and looked steadfastly and was restored and saw all things clearly. And Jesus sent him away to his home, saying, do not even enter into the village. This time, I don't want a person I've healed to even go back to all this crowd that is doing what? Seeking a sign. Just go home, pal. Please don't go back through town. It'll get out later. So, now we come to, any comment on that?
Well, I think the distinction between how Jesus dealt with humans and healing is so dramatically different from how today's healing evangelists deal with cameras and
Yes, sir.
and trying to get attention, where
When he had healed the blind man the day before, he told the blind man that, but the blind man told everybody. So now he heals this guy and says, don't even speak to anybody. Yes. You know, well, I can't read all of these preachers' hearts to know exactly what's in them, but it sure does seem like a lot of them merely want themselves to be very famous. And what did you start to say, Rachel? Yeah. And I think that, and see, that's such a great point, because I think Jesus is representing the God who is interested in the individual. God's never looked for crowds. He's looked for individuals. Now, if all the individuals are so many, they form a crowd, even better. But it's the individual, not the mass, that God's looking for. So Jesus speaks of a shepherd that leaves 99 good sheep and goes out looking for the individual one that's lost. And we can go into other incidents of this. But I think Rachel's right. It says something very theological about God. So let's go to Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Take a few more minutes tonight. And Jesus went forth and his disciples into the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Now, something very famous happens here. I've already mentioned it tonight. And on the way to Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, who do men say that I am? And they told him, saying, oh, some say you're John the Baptist come back. And others say, oh, that you're Elijah who was supposed to come. And others say, oh, you're one of the prophets come back. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers and says unto him, thou art the Christ. Now, it's interesting to look at the Matthew version of this. It's Matthew 16, verse 13. Comes to Caesarea Philippi. I'll let you find that, Jeremy. Matthew 16, 13. Yeah, he comes to Caesarea Philippi and asks the disciples, who do men say that I am? And who do men say that the Son of Man is? And they answer the same thing. Well, John the Baptist, Elijah, maybe Jeremiah. Matthew puts that in. Some people believe you're Jeremiah come back again, or one of the prophets. And then he says to them, but who say ye that I am? We'll just stick with the Matthew version. Peter answers and says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him, pay close attention to this, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto you. You are blessed because you don't listen to what people say. You've learned this from my Father which is in heaven. You are blessed for not listening to people, but listening to God, Peter. And then there's the famous thing that's not in the other Gospels. And I also say unto you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, I think hell it says in the King James, shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now that's not in the Luke or Mark versions, only Matthew right there. But he charges the disciples that they should tell no man that he is the Christ. Now he's just settled with his disciples for the first time. I am the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God. You say that's who I am. I agree with you. Yes, I am. God revealed that to you. Now don't tell anybody. Once again. So sorry to cough over the microphone. From that time began Jesus, verse 21, to show unto his disciples how that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and priests and scribes and be killed, and the third day be raised up. And Peter takes him and begins to rebuke him, saying, "Be it far from thee, Lord. This shall never be unto thee." But Jesus turns and says unto Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou art a stumbling block unto me. For thou mindest not the things of God, but the things of men." Now, in about 2 breaths earlier, he was blessing Peter, because you don't listen to the things of men, you listen to the things of God. A few sentences later, he's cursing Peter, calling him Satan, Shatan, Diabolos, and saying, because you don't listen to the things of God, but only the things of men. Well, which one is it? I love this little Caesarea Philippi story. On one hand, Peter is blessed because he knows how to shut off people's ideas and let God speak to him. On the other hand, he's cursed because sometimes all he does is listen and talk the way people would talk and not see the revelation of God. Well, I think Peter is epitomatic of all of us, isn't he? Julie?
Natures, you've got both kingdoms at work, the spirit man and flesh.
Yeah.
You want to listen to what your feelings are. No, we don't want you to die. Spiritually speaking, it has to happen in order to set everybody free.
No, it's very good, Julie. It's very good. As we read Paul, we'll come to the realization that we still have 2 natures. In my spirit, I'm born again, and I am a son of God. But in my flesh, I'm still a child of Adam. And in between my spirit and my flesh, here's my soul. Not between God and the devil, but just between my flesh and where God is. And the soul swings back. The soul is your mind, your will, and your emotions. It swings back and forth in pendulum-like gravity between the 2. Is that a decent picture to look at? I think something like that is what you were saying. So son of Adam conflicting with the child of God that's in you. You started to say something, Dustin? Okay. All right. Now, Jesus... We'll just stay in the Matthew version. Verse 24, "Then said Jesus unto his disciples, If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his" what? Let him deny himself and take up what? Say it, somebody. What in the world is he talking about? That hasn't happened. They've never seen a man carrying a cross. Jesus hasn't told them that he would be carrying a cross. And the strange thing is that is mentioned in the Mark version, and take up his cross, and the Luke version, and take up his cross daily. Where has this come from? Jesus is predicting to them that he's going to die, not in the Jewish manner of execution, being stoned to death, but he will die in the Roman manner of execution, being crucified. And they have got to be scratching their heads when they hear this and wondering, what is he talking about? Must take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever would save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what shall a man be profited if he shall gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul, as the King James has it? So that gives him a great deal to ponder, doesn't it? The next thing that happens, he's going to pull, about a week later, he'll pull 3 of his disciples aside, Peter, James, and John. And he'll take them up to a mountain. People argue over where this mountain was. We call it the Mount of Transfiguration. And there, Jesus will be transformed before these 3 disciples. Now, it's a very complex thing because Two men appear with Jesus, just materialize. And Peter, James, and John, according to Luke, they were asleep when these two came. But when they wake up, they recognize these two as Moses and Elijah. Now, how did they recognize Moses? You, Moses, man, it's great to, I've seen you on TV, you know. Well, no, they've never seen Moses. How do they know it's Moses? They've never seen Elijah's face. Moses and Elijah aren't wearing name cards. Hello, I'm Moses. Mm-hmm.
But something had to spark them to say that. It wasn't a human thing. It had to be from the Father or it had to be from the Spirit.
Well, yes. We're still in Matthew. Go to Matthew 17, verse 1. And after 6 days, well, I'll wait for it to get it. Matthew 17, 1. After 6 days, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brings them up into a high mountain apart. And he's transfigured before them. In what way? Well, his face shone like the sun. His garment was white as the light. Luke says, as he was praying, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became white and dazzling. Mark says he's transfigured before them, and his garments become glistering and exceeding white. But in all three versions, what we've got is, behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elijah talking with him. In Matthew, there appeared unto them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. The disciples listened to Moses and Elijah talk with Jesus, and they quickly deduce, this is Moses, this is Elijah. Here's the Luke version. And behold, there talked with him two men, which were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spake of his death, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Jesus has just announced to his disciples that he's going to die. He's called these two witnesses from heaven. In the mouth of two or three witnesses, you know. And they're talking about the manner in which Jesus will die. Now, Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they were fully awake, they saw his glory. I'm in the Luke version. Just listen. And the two men that stood with him. Okay, let's get back. Where were we? Matthew. Go to verse 4 of Matthew. And then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Now, if it be your will, let us build here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, or Elias as they have it. New Testament, King James. Now, let me just give you my opinion here. We've got just a few minutes. Where do you think they are? Well, they're where? They're in the temple?
In the presence of God.
Well, yes, but I'm talking about the actual mountain. What mountain do you think they're on? Hebron? That would be way down in Judea. They are up north at the River Jordan, just south of the Red Sea. Well, Sinai is way down, even further down in Egypt.
Where were they?
Well, let's look. We got a guy named Moses in the Old Testament, and when it's time for him to die, he goes up on the west side of Jordan and climbs up to Mount Nebo, speaks with God, and then God puts him on a certain mountain, a valley below a certain mountain, and God takes the life out of Moses. You'll find this at the very end of Deuteronomy. And God buries him there, and no man knows where Moses' grave is unto this day. But wherever it is, it's right across from Jordan, and guess what? From that mountain, you can look across Jordan and see Jericho. Now, is that interesting? So it's a mountain just across from Jericho on the other side of Jordan. Now let's look at a fellow named Elijah in the Old Testament. He's got his servant Elisha, and they passed through Gilgal, Bethel, and then Jericho. And Elijah says to Elisha, if you see me when I go away, you'll get a double portion of my anointing. So they go on down to the River Jordan, same place where Moses had been looking, hundreds of years earlier. Ma'am? Well, yeah, but Joshua got to come across. But yeah, it's that same crossing place. You're exactly right. I taught about it Sunday afternoon where the high priests had carried the Ark of the Covenant and the River Jordan stopped flowing right there so the nation could get across. Same place, right outside of Jericho. Now Elijah leaves the city of Jericho, comes to the River Jordan, rolls up his cloak and smacks the water and says, where is the Lord God of Elijah? And that miracle happens again. The River Jordan stops flowing. Elijah and Elisha go through on the other side, and the waters fall on down. Elijah takes Elisha up to that mountain on the other side of Jordan. It's where Moses was buried by God, somewhere in that vicinity. Is this making sense? All right. Both Moses and Elijah have disappeared on that mountain. Hundreds of years go by, and we meet a fellow named John the Baptist. And he baptizes some in Judea, some down in the deserts of the Judean desert, down near the Dead Sea. But most of his baptizing seems to have been done at a place called Bethany beyond Jordan. Study that out, and you'll find it's a little town just across the Jordan River. If you move east from Jericho, you'll hit it. That's where John the Baptist baptizes. Tradition holds it that when John is taken and beheaded by King Herod, he calls John's disciples and they come get John's headless body. They carry him across Jordan and bury him in those hills. Now that's quite interesting. John the Baptist was an amalgamation of Moses and Elijah in that he preached the word of Moses in the power of Elijah. A lot of interesting things about it. Now here is Jesus on this mountain, and he's just asked his disciples, who do people say you are? Or say I am? And they said, well, some think you're John the Baptist returned from the dead. Some think you're Moses. Some think you're Elijah. Those three are mentioned all three times in that conversation. Just after this, Jesus takes these three disciples up to this mountain. Somewhere around where they're standing is Moses' grave. Somewhere around where they're standing is the place where Elijah went up into heaven. Someplace around where they're standing is the place where John the Baptist's disciples buried him. And they're up here on this Moab mountain. And Jesus starts praying. The disciples fall asleep. They wake up, and Moses and Elijah are there talking with Jesus about the way he must die. Now, if it's not at the exact same spot, it's very near the spot where Elijah went up into heaven and where Moses was buried, and likely where John the Baptist was buried. To me, this is a terrific significance. What's the miracle here? That Moses and Elijah appear? That seems like a miracle. Peter says, we've got to build 3 tabernacles now, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for you, O Jesus the Messiah. And while he was yet speaking, verse 5, Brother Jeremy, while Peter's yet running his mouth about that, behold, a bright cloud overshadows them, and a voice speaks out of the cloud which says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. Next verse. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were sore afraid. And Jesus came to touch the three of them and says, Arise, be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, Moses and Elijah are gone. They see only Jesus. Now, they felt his touch, they saw him, and they heard the voice. They've got their sensory agreements that this was a miraculous thing and that the voice of God spoke out of a cloud. The miracle is not so much that Moses and Elijah had showed up. The miracle is that they had disappeared, and God saying, you don't really need them anymore. All you need is Jesus. Hear ye only him. Behold only him. Well, I'm not getting some real big amens out of that, but I got a couple, and I appreciate it. Moses and Elijah appeared just to disappear, but while they appeared, they talked with Jesus about the way he would die. Can you imagine that conversation? Elijah is saying, now listen, Jesus, you've got power to call fire down from heaven and burn them up. I used to use that myself. They can't kill you. You show them who you really are. And Moses is saying, you know, they tried to kill me several times. But the Lord always preserved me until the time was up. And Jesus said, well, yes, I know your story, Mo and Elijah, and that's great. But I'm here for a specific purpose at a specific time. And he repeats to Moses and Elijah what he had told his disciples just previously. I am going to Jerusalem to be turned over to the sons of Belial and crucified. And his disciples didn't like it. And it could be that Moses and Elijah didn't like it either. Jesus, who has all the power of Moses and all the power of Elijah, he created the universe. How can he be crucified? All he's got to do is blink an eye and his enemies will fall dead. But Jesus uses all his great power for a better purpose. For the Son of Man, when his disciples had asked him one time, give us the power of Elijah so we can call fire down from heaven on these Samaritans, Jesus said, the power of Elijah, you know not what manner of spirit you are of. Elijah came to kill a whole bunch of people. But the Son of Man, I haven't killed anybody, he said. And I came not to take away men's lives, but that through me all men might live. Well, I went over time a minute or so, as I do a lot. Thank you for your patience. Anybody got a parting question, or Julie?
Yeah. Moses went up on the mountain and spoke with God. And I remember righteousness. Jesus represents righteousness
Yes.
too. And then the Shekinah glory on Moses when he came down.
Temporarily, yes.
And then, all right, they are looking and see the glory when they
Yeah.
see this, and it's like, I don't know much about the Elijah part, but it seems like there's a connection.
Yeah.
The glory, righteousness, being in his presence, hearing from him. So I need to learn more about the Elijah part, but obviously.
Well, go read Elijah's story in at the later chapters of 1 Kings, the early chapters of 2 Kings.
I know we're getting ready to go into that.
Yes, it'll be coming up. Yes.
I know where John got his version of the Transfiguration as a one site. Peter mentions it in 2 Peter, the Transfiguration. What do you think Matthew got his version?
Yeah, because he wasn't there. Good question, isn't it? Now, Mark wasn't there either, but of course, so many Bible scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark is actually the Gospel of Peter dictated to Mark. And we're pretty sure of that because the Gospel of Mark has more intimate things about Peter that are skipped over in the other Gospels. So it's like Peter's telling his story from his point of view. But where would Matthew have gotten it? Unless the other two just went to Matthew and said, Matthew, you're a man of letters. Get this down.
It's curious because
Yeah.
if you and I were there, I could understand how we would write about it.
Yep. Good question, Brother Terry. Well, anybody got anything else they want to say? Because we're dismissed. The clock is off. Why don't you go home? You're keeping me.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Brother Terry.